Richard Forer has arrived in Eugene from Albuquerque, New Mexico. However, his inner travels have expanded far beyond any particular time and place. Richard Forer is a former AIPAC member with ultra-Orthodox relatives living in Israel, and author of Breakthrough, Transforming Fear into Compassion. Right here. A new perspective on the Israel-Palestine conflict. It's for sale, and he will sign it for you. Currently, he is spokesperson for the Albuquerque-based Coalition to Stop 30 Billion to Israel. The coalition was the inspiration for billboard campaigns in Chicago, San Francisco, and Seattle. Richard has written numerous articles on behalf of Palestinian rights, including defending organizations around the country that also support those rights, and has appeared in radio interviews, cable TV interviews, and other venues. Recently, he wrote a letter of support to the Eugene Human Rights Commission regarding their decision, now in suspension, to condemn the State of Israel for its lethal raid of May 31st, 2010, on the Mavi Marmara Gaza Freedom Flotilla. And he wrote a letter last year in support of the University of Irvine Muslim Student Union activists regarding their protest actions against Israeli Ambassador Michael Oren's speech in 2010. And lastly, I'd like to introduce Hosina Manu, who came all the way from Roseburg to meet us, and would like to say a few words about the IJAN, the human rights-based International Jewish Anti-Zionist Network. This organization has excellent boycott campaigns in place, advocates the right of return for Palestinian refugees, and is in the midst of sponsoring Holocaust survivor Dr. Hajo Mayer's West Coast tour. This is an important organization for those who identify as Jewish but are uncomfortable with Zionism. Recovering Zionists, I like to say. Bishara, UO Arab Student Union President, will be moderating the discussion after the presentation, and we ask that you hold your comments and questions until Richard has completed his presentation. Thank you all very much for being here.
Minnesota. I just wanted to take a moment to introduce IJAN, the International Jewish Anti-Zionist Network. As the name suggests, we are an international network of anti-Zionist Jews, and we mobilize around Palestine Solidarity Movement, the struggle for Palestine liberation. And our basic framework that we work from, that we approach Palestine Solidarity from, is anti-imperialist and anti-racist. So on the premise that Zionism is a political ideology that's fundamentally racist and colonialist, that serves primarily the interests of Western imperialism. We approach Palestine Solidarity as an indigenous struggle, the Palestinian struggle for liberation, as an issue of indigenous sovereignty. So, secondly, we also have a personal beef with Zionism as Jews, that Zionism has co-opted Judaism and has separated many of us as an international body of activists. We're very diverse culturally within Judaism, spiritually, and we have a beef with how that's been taken away from us, and this political ideology has usurped Jewish identity and really silenced the dialogue around what it is to be Jewish, what it is to support an imperialist project like Israel. So that's basically ideologically what IJAN, where we come to this work from. More concretely, we support the call for boycott, divest, and sanctions that the Palestinian Civil Society declared in 2005. We have nationally a lot of chapters around the country. We have a chapter in Atlanta, New York, Chicago, Twin Cities, Bay Area. Unfortunately, nothing here in Oregon or in Washington. And we have sector work. So if you are interested in getting involved as an educator, as a student, as in the spiritual network. So if you're an anti-Zionist Jew, please come and talk to me if you want to get involved. I'm going to pass around this sign-up sheet on the back side of the Al-Nakba Awareness Project, and thank you so much for the work that you do locally here. On the back side of this, there's a lot of wonderful resources. You can go online, and our website is on here. So thank you, Richard, for coming all this way, and I look forward to hearing you speak.
Thank you. First, I want to thank Mariah and Jack and Chris of the Al-Nakba Awareness Project. I know their organization has worked very hard to educate the public about the reality of the Israeli occupation of the Palestinian people. I also want to thank the Arab Student Union and the Muslim Student Association for co-sponsoring my visit. I'm sure your groups also must deal with a lot of resistance and probably prejudice. And without all of your voices, the world would be a much darker place than it currently is. And to everyone here, wherever you stand on this issue, I want to thank you for coming and for your interest in another perspective on this conflict. I only ask that you listen to what I say with an open mind, knowing that you can always check my facts to confirm or invalidate whatever you hear tonight. So let me begin by saying this. If the prospects for peace are to be advanced, it is crucial that greater numbers, especially in the United States, become seriously engaged in this issue. We have to guard against apathy. Apathy is deadly because it gives leaders the permission to act without concern for the implications of their behavior. And it enables them to lie about things they might not otherwise lie about if they knew the eyes of the world were focused on their behavior, and that they would be held accountable for their actions. I'm going to speak tonight about the insights that were the fruits of a transformation from reflexive loyalty to the policies of the State of Israel to advocacy for the human rights of all people. By resolving the fear, confusion, and prejudice that is so prevalent today and that prevented a rational understanding of the reality of the Israel-Palestine dilemma, I am certain that my transformation contains valuable lessons for all of us and can be applied to any conflict anywhere in the world to the benefit of all sides. I'll also attempt to clarify the arguments I repeatedly made for most of a lifetime, which I thought protected my people, the Jewish people and Israel, from persecution, but which, in reality, merely served to keep me in bondage to an unexamined belief system and contributed to the suffering of millions on both sides. But first, I want to make a suggestion. As you listen, I hope you will deeply consider what I say, but please do not believe what I say. If you simply believe what I say, I'm afraid that you will not find out for yourselves, to the best of your ability, the documented history of this conflict. Your understanding will remain either rigidly framed by prior indoctrination, or it will change randomly depending on who you happen to be listening to at any moment in time. And you will never gain an authentic and organic understanding of this conflict. You'll be at the mercy of others who may formulate their conclusions on the basis of selectively chosen evidence that reinforces pre-existing points of view rather than documented fact. In order to end conflict, we need to take responsibility for our beliefs and find out if they are based on actual events or on distortions of those events. There is a difference between a respected academic historian and an individual who decides to write on a particular subject because he wants to promote a certain view, his own view. When a historian researches a subject, he doesn't decide beforehand what his conclusions will be. He allows his research to dictate those conclusions. On the other hand, someone whose intention is to promote his or her version of history will select evidence that supports that version. So do the most objective research possible, as I did, and do it with integrity. Otherwise, you will never discover your role in the suffering of others, nor will you discover how to alleviate that suffering. and you will never resolve your own anxiety and suffering. As a Jew or Palestinian, you will always be left with the dilemma of victimization. Why does the world not understand my people, juxtaposed against compelling evidence that is impossible to ignore? If we are going to stem the tide of inhumanity and its momentum, we need to do the hard work of getting in touch with our own inborn wisdom. Such work necessitates an inquiry into the beliefs and images that we take for granted, that form a large part of our personal and collective identities. Not just Israel and Palestine, but the future of the world depends on each and every one of us to bring this period of man's inhumanity toward his fellow man to a close. If we abdicate this responsibility, we cannot complain if we see no improvement in the conditions of the world. Up until the midpoint of the Second Lebanon War in the summer of 2006, I believed that the true cause of the Israel-Palestine conflict was the Arab world's non-acceptance of a Jewish state in their midst. And I believe this lack of acceptance resulted from centuries of hatred of Jewish religion and culture. I also saw elements within the Christian world as still harboring the anti-Semitic attitudes that produced centuries of pogroms and the cruelest event in mankind's history, the torture and extermination of 6 million Jews and millions of others because they were judged to be inferior. I believe that modern-day Christian insensitivity to Jewish suffering supported the Arab and Muslim world's hatred of Jews and Judaism. But then I began a conscientious study of the history of Israel and Palestine. My goal was to learn the truth of this history as best I could. I chose to read Jewish authors only, knowing that otherwise I would suspect bias. The majority of my research came from Israeli authors with access to the Israeli State Archives, Central Zionist Archives, Israeli Defense Forces Archives, as well as many other Israeli government sources. I examined material from both sides of the issue and randomly selected assertions made by the authors and looked at the sources they cited in order to support their assertions. I wanted to make sure that the author I was quoting was not taking information out of context or distorting the intended meaning of the statements that he was quoting in his book. In some cases, the author's misrepresentation of the original meaning was outlandish. What I learned during the course of my study transformed me. Most people who objectively research this subject will conclude that the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians is not based on religion or culture. It is based on land, two peoples competing for one land. And they would recognize that the religious and cultural disparagement between the two sides is a consequence of that competition. On the surface, I agree that land is the primary issue. But what I was fortunate enough to encounter goes much deeper, and that is that the root cause of conflict is the attachment to a limited identity and the beliefs and images that emanate from and reinforce that identity. Our beliefs and images are rarely, if ever, questioned. As long as we resist such questioning, conflict will continue to arise. For example, I unquestionably believed that Jews had been the victims of hostile attitudes for thousands of years, and that the entire world, especially the Arab world, was anti-Semitic. With such a dominating perspective, I was bound to interpret the words and behavior of all others as perpetually predisposed to ignore the suffering of my people. For all of us, ideas or behaviors that fall within the boundaries of one's identity are interpreted as unobjectionable. Ideas or behavior that fall outside of those boundaries are interpreted as threatening, as the other. Fear arises. We unconsciously superimpose enemy images onto the other. We look at the world through this filter of fear, and we automatically reduce to objects all that we perceive as threats. Then we hide from, destroy, or incapacitate these objects so as to restore apparent safety into our lives. Many Jewish people, influenced by collective memory, equate Arabs with Nazis or other persecutors. A common belief among Jews, including myself at one time, is that Israel, the Jewish home, is a shelter from a cruel world. This belief is a critical aspect of Jewish identity. To maintain this identity, some must justify Israel's policies as necessary responses to terrorism against an unremittingly violent people. Dualistic thinking such as this conceives of a world of self and other, us against them, good and evil. Our emotions, our attitudes toward others, the way we interpret events, what we notice and what we don't notice will mirror our worldview, thereby confirming and reinforcing it. In short, we create the world we live in. Thus, the great struggle all of us must take on, if we truly want peace and respect between peoples, is to transform our consciousness from us against them to one of tolerance and understanding. It was not until I inquired into my indoctrination and began to learn a more accurate history of Israel-Palestine that I was able to relinquish my enemy images. I cannot express in words what a great relief it is to see all people as human, not as inherent enemies. And when I say as human, I include all the flaws and contradictions that we all possess. When this relinquishment occurred, I realized that I was as much Palestinian as Israeli and as much Christian or Muslim as Jew. With this new awareness, compassion replaced fear and clarity replaced confusion. Unlike fear, compassion is the ability to stand in the shoes of the other. Compassion sees from all perspectives without allegiance to any one perspective. Therefore, clarity arises with compassion. Compassion seeks to understand all behavior, no matter how barbaric. Compassion, combined with insight, understands that no behavior occurs in a vacuum, that each of us contributes to the collective mind of mankind, and each of us is responsible for the suffering in the world and for the world's destiny. Peace is only possible when we care for people on both sides equally. We don't have to like the other, but we have to recognize that he is just as entitled to self-determination as us, that he has the same human need for dignity as do we. We also have to ask why the other acts as he does. Have we played roles in inciting his behavior? Until we take responsibility for the parts we play in the drama of human suffering, and as it relates to the Israel-Palestine conflict, peace has no chance. And the people we claim to care about will continue to suffer and die now and into the bloody future, in Israel, in Palestine, and throughout the world. They will suffer and die because our true goal is not their well-being. Our true goal is to maintain a presumed identity, to confirm the beliefs and images that we incorrectly associate with our identity. So we must ask ourselves, are we willing to inquire into our indoctrination and give up our enemy images? Or will we hold on to our dualistic views and enemy images and perpetuate conflict and suffering for all involved? One of the most common issues in the debate over Israel-Palestine is blame. I want to look at two allegations that I constantly hear. The first is the blanket statement that Zionism is racism. Growing up in the aftermath of the Holocaust, every Jewish person of my parents' and grandparents' generation, as well as most Jews of my generation, sincerely believed that Zionism was a movement whose intent was to protect our people from persecution and death. From that perspective, it is inconceivable that a simple need for survival could be interpreted as racism. So it should come as no surprise that most Jews would label anyone who calls them racist as racist themselves or anti-Semitic. Equating Zionism with racism gives the impression that Zionism is ideologically comparable to white supremacist movements. These movements are purveyors of racism. Zionism was an inevitable, albeit problematic, reaction to a uniquely virulent kind of racism, and for most Jews is not inherently racist. To reduce Zionism to the label of racism minimizes the reasons that made Zionism necessary in the first place. The fact is that most Jews in the United States did not grow up indoctrinated into a culture of discrimination, and their support for Zionism as they conceive of it is not founded upon a prejudice toward a particular race or religion. However, those who still support Zionism need to understand that for the most part, criticism of Israel is not meant to demean the history of Jewish persecution, but is itself a reaction to policies Israel has adopted on the part of the Jewish people. Whether you support it or not, Zionism is the ideological force that enables the dispossession of another people. The act being perpetrated by Israel in the occupied territories affects the lives of millions of people every day, and its dehumanization is a direct result of Zionism. No Israeli government since the 1967 war has put a halt to the growth of settlements in the West Bank. During Yitzhak Rabin's second term as prime minister, the settler population in the West Bank grew at a faster rate than ever before. The second allegation I want to talk about is the reflexive use of terms such as anti-Semite, anti-Israel, Israel hate group, Nazi, or self-hating Jew that are used to characterize any who criticize Israeli policy. For the sake of this discussion, these terms are synonymous with the understanding that all except self-hating Jew have been directed at critics from any background. Most of Israel's critics believe certain Israeli policies are in violation of international humanitarian law. Nearly every Jewish critic of Israel that I have met believes that the Israeli government has hijacked their heritage by replacing morality, so esteemed in Judaism, with bigotry and exclusion. They believe, therefore, that by opposing policies that relegate Palestinians to lives of second-class citizenship, they are preserving the integrity of their tradition. What exactly is anti-Semitic in such a point of view? Is becoming more knowledgeable about a painful subject indicative of anti-Semitism? Isn't greater knowledge a hallmark of Jewish learning? Isn't it fundamental to solving problems? Is caring about another people a betrayal of one's roots or a sign of hatred? If the roles of Israelis and Palestinians were reversed, most of the activists I know would be criticizing a Palestinian government. I'd like to read a few quotes. The first quote: Israel's right to exist within recognized borders and to live in peace must be accepted by Palestinians and all other neighbors, end of quote. The second quote: the Arabs must acknowledge openly and specifically that Israel is a reality and has a right to live in peace behind secure and recognized borders, and with a firm Arab pledge to terminate any further acts of violence against the legally constituted nation of Israel, end of quote. The person who made these statements has been called an anti-Semite, a Nazi sympathizer, and a bigot. Israeli officials and many of my Jewish relations consider this person an enemy of Israel. He is Jimmy Carter, whose skill in crafting peace with Egypt makes him arguably the best friend that Israel has ever had. I want to contrast Carter's statements with what someone else said, which is that the Nazis had operated on God's behalf to chase the Jews from Europe and shepherd them to Palestine. And Adolf Hitler was a hunter sent by God who was tasked with expediting God's will of having the Jews reestablish a state of Israel. This person further believes that Jesus Christ will return to earth and that Jews will have to convert to Christianity or perish in a lake of fire. Moreover, he believes that the Jewish people are guilty of deicide, the one unpardonable sin, the murder of Christ. This belief has been at the heart of anti-Semitism for nearly 2,000 years. Without this belief, Adolf Hitler could not have relied on both the hatred and the silence of those who supported or closed their eyes to the evils of the Holocaust. The person who made these statements is the Reverend John Hagee, the Christian evangelical leader. Hagee is a huge fundraiser for Israel's settlement enterprise. For 25 years, he has hosted a Night to Honor Israel, an event that has attracted the highest-ranking Israeli leaders and American politicians. He is treated as a dear friend of Israel's. I point to the contrast between Hagee and Carter's characterizations to show how confused the issue becomes when people have not come to grips with their fear of extermination and their unexamined enemy images. How someone who equates Adolf Hitler to Moses and who prays for the eventual demise of Judaism is embraced, and how another, who prays for Israel to live in peace with its neighbors, is demonized because he offers constructive and necessary criticism. No one who has ever called me an anti-Semite even knows me. None of my relatives, friends, or acquaintances, including staunch Zionists, have ever suggested that I hate Israel or Jews. They know better because they know me. To call me anti-Semitic simply because I care for all people instead of some people is disturbing and illogical. Did David Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister of Israel, suddenly become a self-hating Jew when he admitted that Israel had stolen the land from the Palestinians? Or when he said late in his life, quote, "If I have to choose between a small Israel without territories but with peace and a greater Israel without peace, I prefer a small Israel," end of quote. Was the warning of former chiefs of Israel's Shin Bet security services, Ami Ayalon, Carmi Galon, Yaakov Peri, and Abraham Shalom, that Israel was heading downhill towards near catastrophe unless it makes peace with the Palestinians, an anti-Semitic slur? Was their appeal that Israel end the occupation for its own good, an attempt to delegitimize Israel? Soon after the 1967 war, when the occupation began, Yitzhak Rabin, Israel's chief of staff, recommended to Prime Minister Levi Eshkol that Israel return the territories to the Palestinians in exchange for peace. He said that otherwise a, quote, South African situation would develop. 27 years later, as Prime Minister, Rabin said, "We are paying with blood for ruling over another people. Ruling over another people has corrupted us." Was Rabin a self-hating Jew? Was Ehud Olmert guilty of self-hatred when he admitted in September 2008 that the Jewish settlers in Hebron were conducting pogroms against the Palestinians? If so, did Olmert redeem himself 3 months later when he launched Operation Cast Lead upon the citizens of Gaza? Where then is the hatred? Is not the hatred in the mind of the one who does not have the humanity to ask why someone is critical of Israeli policy? Rather than investigating the criticism, the slanderer takes the easy road of pandering to his or her fear. Then he transfers responsibility for his oppressive feelings onto the critic and scapegoats him or her with these vicious labels. Those who resort to slander are not victims of anti-Semitism. They are victims of an unexamined mind which has no tolerance for negative images of Israel. Terms such as self-hating Jew or anti-Semite are emotionally charged retaliatory weapons meant to disgorge feelings of hatred, fear, and anger that arise in the face of criticism of Israel. But without examining the beliefs that give rise to these oppressive feelings, the possibilities for real understanding and peace are eradicated. Prior to my transformation, I never used any of these terms to invalidate a fellow Jew, but I often wondered what could make another Jew so uninformed that he would be convinced of the righteousness of the other side. And I did attribute hatred of Jews to some of Israel's non-Jewish critics. Fortunately, hearing criticism of Israel, especially from trusted friends whom I knew to be free of prejudice, even if I disagreed with the criticism, kept open a small corner of my mind and allowed me to retain a measure of humanity. It was not until I finally undertook an examination of my beliefs that I realized that criticism of Israel was not even my principal concern. More compelling was the fear that the criticism may have been warranted and that my belief in an innocent Israel was unwarranted. When I finally awoke and saw what my false beliefs had led me to support and justify, I understood that I had not been defending Israel, at least the Israel that actually exists. Like so many others, I was defending an idealistic image of Israel in my mind that arose out of my indoctrination or attachment to a limited Jewish identity. My defense of Israel was a smokescreen to hide the fact that I was afraid of what I might find out about Israel and about myself if I inquired into my beliefs. Unconscious of my inhumanity, I was willing to enable the suffering of millions to protect myself from reality. By denying Israel's history of repression and by ignoring the suffering of the Palestinian people, I interpreted all violence from Palestinians as acts of hatred, not the acts of a desperate people, a small minority of whom resorted to violence as the only way they knew to maintain a degree of self-respect in the face of repression. My support for policies that cultivated despair and hopelessness among Palestinians contributed to the suffering of Israelis that would inevitably come from the retaliation that Israeli strategists knew would occur. Rather than make peace, the Israeli government has been willing to sacrifice the lives of its own citizens in order to fulfill an out-of-control Zionist ideology. The real conflict for all who ignore the suffering of another people is the inability to integrate the hard-to-believe but inescapable awareness of Israel's inhumane treatment of non-Jews with unquestioned loyalty to the Israeli government. One consideration acknowledges the dark side of Israeli policy. The other denies the dark side exists. This internal struggle is the source of the indiscriminate use of labels such as self-hating Jew or anti-Semite. If Israel's defenders want to ensure Israel's safety and make sure it is not ostracized from the world community any more than it already has been, they would be far more effective if they let go of their self-destructive defense of unexamined beliefs, let go of tactics that engender conflict, and demand that the Israeli government act with integrity and adherence to international law. To call criticism of Israeli behavior anti-Semitic is no different than calling someone anti-American for criticizing American policies that discriminated against African Americans. And holding Israel to the same standards of conduct as we hold other countries does not delegitimize Israel. The only delegitimization of Israel taking place are the policies and the support for those policies that humiliate an entire people and deny them a future for themselves and their children. Now I'd like to clarify some of the historical and moral arguments that are regularly made to justify the dispossession of the Palestinian people and that prevent the fulfillment of Palestinian self-determination. Most of these arguments are ones that I used to make. I'll start with UN Resolution 181, the partition plan of 1947. First, let me say that from a moral point of view, it is hard to justify the passage of 181, which was more a politically motivated act than a humanitarian one. Resolution 181 is one of the few arguments I commonly hear that I did not make. The reason I didn't is because I wasn't knowledgeable enough to have even heard of it. Like those who utilize this argument, all I would have needed to convince myself of its persuasiveness is to have overheard a single sentence that Israel accepted a partition plan and the Palestinians rejected one. One sentence would have been enough to convict the Palestinians of obstructing peace and to justify my conviction that Palestinians have no right to complain about their circumstances. This argument is morally corrupt and historically deceptive. Does Palestinian rejection of 181 justify Israel's continued expropriation of Palestinian land? Does it justify the brutal methods of a relentless occupation? Resolution 181 took 56% of mandatory Palestine and gave it to the Jewish people, who owned 7% of the land at the time. 43% went to the Palestinians, with the remaining 1%, Jerusalem and Bethlehem, under the authority of the United Nations. The new Jewish state would have had a 49% Arab minority that would have become a majority probably in less than 5 years. It is utterly naive to believe that Israel would accept such an outcome. Yet, in an explicit pledge made to the United Nations, the Jewish agency under the leadership of David Ben-Gurion falsely stated that the new state, quote, will not be Jewish in the sense that the Jewish community will be superior in status to other communities, end of quote. In other words, acceptance of 181 was a tactical move and, as it turned out, a prelude to future expansion. David Ben-Gurion, May 1947, quote, "Does anybody really think that the original meaning of the Balfour Declaration and the mandate, and indeed that of the millenarian yearning of the Jewish people, was not that of establishing a Jewish state in the whole of Eretz Yisrael?" End of quote. Ben-Gurion again, a few months later, December 1947, quote, "There are no final settlements in history. There are no eternal borders, and no political demands are final." End of quote. 1 week later, Ben-Gurion pledged to his political party's Central Committee that the borders established by 181 were not final. Following Ben-Gurion's lead, Yigal Allon, the most prominent general, Israeli general of the 1948 war, stated, quote, "The borders of partition cannot be for us the final borders. The partition plan is a compromise plan that is unjust to the Jews. We are entitled to decide our borders according to our defense needs." The second argument, Israel has always tried to make peace, and the Palestinians have always rejected peace. With the recent release of the Palestine Papers, the true nature of Israel's more recent negotiations with the Palestinians has come to light, along with the knowledge that Israel's government has deliberately misled its own citizens and the international community. But since Israel's defenders will continue to ignore this revelation and repeat their common arguments, a brief review of the history of peace offers is warranted. I begin with the Syrian proposal following the 1948 war, in which Syria offered to take in 300,000 Palestinian refugees. UN mediator and future Nobel Peace Prize recipient Ralph Bunche pleaded with Ben-Gurion to respond to the Syrian offer. But Ben-Gurion refused, just as he refused to talk with Egypt's Gamal Nasser, who used Yugoslavian, Maltese, and Quaker emissaries to try to negotiate with the Israeli prime minister. Ben-Gurion's only response was to accuse Nasser of being the Hitler of the Middle East, a phrase that frightened Jews around the world into believing that another Holocaust would be imminent were it not for the fortitude of Israel's leaders. Other attempts to make peace were offered by Jordan, Yugoslavia, and the United States, all of which were rejected or ignored by Israel. Benny Morris, an arch-Zionist and one of Israel's leading historians, said, quote, "For decades, Ben-Gurion and successive administrations after his lied to the Israeli public about the post-1948 peace overtures and about Arab interest in a deal. The Arab leaders, with the possible exception of Abdullah, king of Jordan, were presented, one and all, as a recalcitrant collection of warmongers hell-bent on Israel's destruction. The recent opening of the Israeli archives offers a far more complex picture." End of quote. Moshe Dayan, one of Israel's greatest heroes, said, and I quote, "The question is not what is the solution, but how do we live without a solution?" End of quote. Dayan also said, "The state of Israel must see the sword as the main, if not the only instrument with which to keep its morale high and to retain its moral tension. Toward this end it may, no, it must invent dangers, and to do this it must adopt the method of provocation and revenge. And above all, let us hope for a new war with the Arab countries, so that we may finally get rid of our troubles and acquire our space." End of quote. Ze'ev Meaz, former advisor to Yitzhak Rabin and director of the MA program at the Israeli Defense Forces National Defense College, said, "Most of the peace initiatives in the Arab-Israeli conflict came either from the Arab world, from the international community, or from grassroots and informal channels." End of quote. Currently, less than 50% of the West Bank is accessible to Palestinians. A study of Israel's history leads to the unavoidable conclusion that Israel's desire for peace has always been secondary to its desire to acquire more and more land. Tzipi Livni's words reveal what has always been obvious to Palestinians living in occupied territory and to anyone who has studied the history of Israel-Palestine, that peace negotiations are used by Israel as an excuse not to make peace. I quote, "Israel takes more land so that the Palestinian state will be impossible. The Israeli policy is to take more and more land day after day, and that at the end of the day we'll say, that is impossible. We already have the land, and we cannot create the state. End of quote. Moving on to another argument, one that was the ace in the hole for me, was that at the Camp David summit in 2000, Prime Minister Ehud Barak offered Yasser Arafat a generous peace proposal, and Arafat turned Barak down cold. Soon after the failure at Camp David, I watched an interview with Chief U.S. Middle East negotiator Dennis Ross on the McNeil-Lehrer NewsHour. I can still see his face today. Ross explained that Israeli Prime Minister Barak had made an unprecedented and generous offer to the Palestinians of 94 to 96% of the West Bank and all of Gaza, and that Arafat had turned down the offer. Ross suggested that peace had been agonizingly close, that all of the Palestinian negotiators urged Arafat to accept the proposal, and that Arafat had refused. Arafat's refusal of an alleged generous offer proved to me that Israel had always bent over backwards to accommodate the Palestinians. Years later, after many accounts came out about what had actually happened at Camp David, I learned that the Clinton administration had deliberately scapegoated Arafat because they wanted to help Barak in his re-election battle against Ariel Sharon. I also learned that the Israelis had never presented a written proposal at the summit, nor did they present any maps. In his book, The Missing Piece, published in 2004, Ross said that after the summit, President Clinton proposed a better deal, and Arafat rejected. This deal would have given Palestinian control over 92% of the West Bank, with an Israeli security presence along 15% of the border with Jordan. However, the 92% does not reflect the large perimeter areas that surround Jewish settlements, nor does it reflect roads, Jewish-only roads, and about 100 Israeli military checkpoints. Under this arrangement, known as the Clinton parameters, the Palestinians would have received less than 75% of the West Bank, which represents 22% of mandatory Palestine. One member of the American team at Camp David, Egyptian-American translator and diplomat Gamal Halal, has worked for every U.S. administration from George H.W. Bush to Barack Obama. In a September 2002 interview, Halal said that once Barak was at Camp David, he locked himself up in his room. Quote, he didn't have one single gathering with Arafat except for tea, with the condition not to discuss things of substance. End of quote. Aaron David Miller was another member of the U.S. team. Miller served as advisors to 6 secretaries of state on the Arab-Israeli peace process. In speaking of Barak's chief negotiator at Camp David, Miller said, and I quote, in the words of Shlomo Ben Ami, the Prime Minister's idea of the concessions required of Israel for such a sweeping accord fell far short of even modest Palestinian expectations. End of quote. Miller also said there was not a formalized written proposal that covered the 4 core issues: refugee, security, borders, and Jerusalem. There was no deal on the table. End of quote. Former ambassador to Israel, Ned Walker, also on the U.S. team, said, and I quote, of the ideas discussed at Camp David, there is no way in hell that the Palestinian people would have accepted this thing. End of quote. Moving on to the next common argument. The reason so many Palestinians left Israel in 1948 is because the region's Arab leaders urged them to do so with the caveat that they would be able to return to their villages and homes when the fighting ended. First, this claim is hypocritical. It implies that if Arab leaders had not encouraged the Palestinians to leave, the Israelis would have allowed them to stay. If that had been the case, there would have been more Palestinians left in Israel than Israelis. Since everybody knows that the Zionist movement would accept nothing less than a Jewish state, they must also know that ethnic cleansing or apartheid would have been the only solutions to that problem, had it come to pass. From a historical point of view, in 1959, Professor Walid Khalidi proved it to be a fabrication. His findings were independently corroborated 2 years later by Irish scholar and UN diplomat Erskine Childers. By examining the archives of Arab governments and newspapers and the reports of the CIA as well as the BBC, which monitored every single Arab radio broadcast in 1948, both men demonstrated that no such encouragement had occurred. To the contrary, the Arab broadcasts appealed to people not to leave their homes. When asked by the United Nations to account for its long-standing claim, Israel failed to produce one iota of evidence. Misinformation like this has influenced generations of Jews to dismiss the Palestinian people's narrative and slander them as propagandists and liars. The next argument that I often made, Israel is the only real democracy in the Middle East. When all else failed, I would fall back onto this argument. When I awoke from my ignorance, I realized how illogical and self-incriminating this argument is. By arguing that Israel is the only true democracy in the Middle East, I was attempting to assert Israel's moral superiority so that I could justify, with regard to its policies and actions, Israel's immoral inferiority. Try telling Palestinians in East Jerusalem that Israel is a democracy. Of the many things I could say on this subject, let me just say that within Israel proper, not one new Palestinian town has been created since 1948, while 1,200 new Israeli towns have been created during the same period. And of course, Israel opposes incorporating the West Bank into its democracy because of its fear of losing its Jewish character. Israeli governments have only believed in a version of democracy that allows them to control demography, or the number of Palestinians with Israeli citizenship. In reality, Israel proper is an ethnocracy, whereby Jews are afforded greater rights and greater benefits than non-Jews. Consider this analogy. It is 1950s America in the Deep South. An African-American woman goes to the sheriff of her town to bring charges against two men who lynched her husband simply because he was black. The sheriff ignores her complaint and attempts to assuage her anger by saying, "It may not be perfect, but the United States is the world's greatest democracy." Do you think the words of a sheriff who is unwilling to investigate a vicious murder and hate crime would console the victim's widow? I don't. Moving on to the next argument, Hamas oppresses its own people and refuses to recognize Israel's right to exist. My answer to the first part of the statement is that I agree that Hamas oppresses its people. But if one chooses to be critical of Hamas's oppression, how can one ignore Israel's decades-long oppression and, to borrow Ben-Gurion's language, its theft of the land from the Palestinians? If supporters of Israel are so concerned about the welfare of the Palestinian people, they should demand that Israel end the blockade of Gaza and end the occupation. Thanks. Regarding Hamas's refusal to recognize Israel's right to exist, Israel has never recognized Hamas's victory in the democratic elections of 2006, nor has Israel ever recognized that the Palestinians have a right to a state. Neither Egypt nor Jordan was required to recognize Israel prior to their treaties. In fact, Israel's argument that it will not engage in talks with Hamas until Hamas recognizes Israel is an excuse not to engage in talks. If Hamas were to recognize Israel, what Israel would it be recognizing? Israel's borders are undefined. From Hamas's perspective, recognition of Israel is equivalent to acceptance of the occupation. United Nations Special Coordinator to the Middle East for the Middle East peace process, Alvaro de Soto, has said that only if Israel recognizes the right of the Palestinian people to a state within the 1967 borders would the question ever arise as to whether Hamas should recognize Israel. Another argument that I made on a regular basis was that Jews were expelled from Arab countries in approximately the same numbers as Palestinians expelled from what is now Israel. This argument has been gaining momentum lately among diehard supporters of Israeli policy. The main thrust of the argument is not to provide compensation for Jewish immigrants, but rather to demean the suffering of the Palestinian people. Because those who promote this argument can only see themselves in the place of Jews, they only care about Jewish suffering. Palestinian suffering is irrelevant. This narcissistic argument makes Palestinians responsible for Jewish emigration from Arab lands, which they had nothing to do with, while ignoring that the emigration was a reaction to Israel's ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians. The ultra-religious Shas party, led by Eliyahu Yashai, has admitted that in exploiting this argument, its goal is to foil any possible peace deal with the Palestinians. The fact is that a majority of Mizrahi Jewish immigrants left their homes of their own accord, many because they heeded Israel's offer of free transportation and housing. Israel recruited many of these emigres in order to build a solid Jewish majority. Many of them had enough time to gather their possessions. Many were compensated with properties stolen from the Palestinians. Those Jews who were expelled and who did lose property have always been free to file claims with the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. There is a great deal of evidence also that Israel carried out false flag operations in Arab countries in order to scare Arab Jews into immigrating to Israel. In both Cairo and Baghdad, and possibly in other Arab cities, Israel's Mossad planted bombs in Jewish areas so that Jews would fear that Arab terrorists were intent on killing them. It worked. Most Iraqi and Egyptian Jews left their homes and moved to Israel. But what about the assertion that Palestinian expulsion and Jewish replacement are justified by the Torah, that God gave the land to the Jewish people? This assertion is heard not only among ultra-religious Jews, but among Reform, Conservative, and unaffiliated Jews. More importantly, because a divine Jewish claim to the land is taught to school children, it acts as a subtle influence upon the thinking of those who believe in Zionist ideology. Is it not hypocritical for Jews to decide which of God's proclamations, or mitzvah, commandments, they will honor and which they will ignore? Most of these Jews do not keep kosher, and most do not honor all 613 commandments. So they pick and choose God's teachings that they believe serve as justifications for their behavior, all the while acting not out of love for or responsibility to God, but out of the most selfish impulses, greed and separation. Did God give them the land with permission to dispossess and humiliate a different people? According to Judaism, all Jews are obligated to rectify injustice. This is how they bring God into the world. This practice is tikkun olam, or repairing the world, and it comes from the first chapter of the Torah, Genesis. By turning their backs on this sacred teaching, these Jews not only create injustice, they hold the entire world hostage to their selfishness and lack of compassion. I want to move on to a brief discussion of Gaza. I used to believe in purity of arms, the idea that Israeli soldiers acted only in self-defense and endeavored to treat the Palestinians humanely. Lebanon in 2006 and Gaza from December 2008 to January 2009 are recent operations in which the world severely chastised Israel for its use of disproportionate force and the deliberate targeting of civilians. Human rights groups such as B'Tselem, the Israeli human rights group, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, the International Red Cross, the National Lawyers Guild, UNICEF, and the Goldstone Report, and many Israeli journalists are in agreement on this issue. Israel has denounced the criticism, but Lebanon and Gaza are not isolated anomalies of Israeli strategy. The fact is, as Zeev Schiff, Israel's preeminent military analyst once said, quote, "The Israeli army has always struck civilian populations, purposely and consciously. The army has never distinguished civilian from military targets, but purposely attacked civilian targets," end of quote. He's confessing to a war crime. Raphael Eitan, who had been Ariel Sharon's second in command for many years, was Israeli chief of staff from 1978 until 1983. During his tenure, Eitan presided over Israel's destruction of Palestinian refugee camps such as Sabra and Shatila in Lebanon. He proposed that for each incident of stone throwing, Israel should build 10 settlements. He stated, "When we have settled the land, all the Arabs will be able to do about it will be to scurry around like drugged roaches in a bottle." End of quote. Eitan eventually admitted to having ordered his soldiers to brutalize prisoners and impose collective punishment. Founder of the extreme right ultranationalist Somet Party, Movement for Zionist Renewal, Eitan also confessed to Israel's brutality in the following remark, quote, "I don't believe in peace, because if they had done to us what we did to them, we'd never agree to make peace." End of quote. Getting back to Lebanon and Gaza, one of Israel's arguments is that Hezbollah and Hamas embedded their soldiers in civilian population. Certainly there were cases where Arab fighters were in population centers, but for the most part the human rights reports dispute the Israeli claim and make a compelling case for why soldiers were not embedded within their population. In fact, there are documented cases where Israeli soldiers in Gaza used Palestinian families as shields while not providing the protections that they themselves had, such as body armor, helmets, and sandbags. If Israeli military strategists claimed that embedding took place in Lebanon in 2006, they surely would have planned for the possibility that Hamas would embed its fighters in Gaza in 2008, and Gaza being one of the most densely populated places on the planet. Clearly, however, these strategists made little attempt to distinguish between the target and the shield. The statistics bear this out. About 70% of the fatally wounded were civilians. After the United Nations Human Rights Council's Goldstone report on Operation Cast Lead was made public, many Israeli officials defamed Goldstone as an anti-Semite. Goldstone is a Zionist. His daughter made Aliyah to Israel, and Goldstone had actually been acknowledged by the Israel government for his record of impartiality. At the beginning of Operation Cast Lead, Eliyahu Yashai, the head of Shas, who was deputy prime minister at the time, urged the IDF to bomb thousands of houses to destroy Gaza. 9 months later, as Minister of the Interior, Yashai slandered Goldstone as an abominable anti-Semite for heading a mission that concluded that the IDF did exactly what Yashai wanted them to do. The Goldstone report accuses Israel of deliberately targeting civilians and of possible war crimes and crimes against humanity. Israel denies the charges, claiming, as it has always done, that the invasion was necessitated by security concerns. In order to intelligently make that argument, however, Israel must ignore the fact that on November 4th, 2008, it violated a ceasefire with Hamas that had reduced the number of rocket attacks from the hundreds per month to 2 or 3 per month, with the small number being launched by renegade groups who were not cooperating with Hamas. As if Israel's blockade of Gaza and reducing its residents to a bare subsistence level of existence were not enough, Israel's purpose in breaking the ceasefire and invading Gaza was not to stop the rocket attacks. Its purpose was to collectively punish Gaza's residents for their support of Hamas and to destroy Hamas because of its unwillingness to collaborate with Israeli dispossession of Palestinian society. To bring more balance into the one-dimensional and misleading argument that Israel invaded Gaza in order to put an end to the rocket attacks, I'd like to cite some figures. Between 2000 and 2008, a 9-year period, Palestinian groups fired a total of 8,088 mostly homemade rockets and mortars into southern Israel. From 2001 through 2008, 18 Israelis were killed. In just 9 months, not 9 years, 9 months, from September 2005 to June 2006, Israel fired nearly 8,000 far more sophisticated rockets and mortars into Gaza. From 2005 to 2007, the IDF killed 1,290 Palestinians in Gaza, including 222 children. Former National Security Advisor and former head of Mossad, Ephraim Halevi, said, and he told this to the Israeli government, quote, "If Israel's goals were to remove the threat of rockets from the residents of southern Gaza, opening the border crossings would have ensured such quiet for a generation," end of quote. Before concluding this discussion of Gaza, I need to mention Beirut's Dahiyya quarter. This Shiite stronghold was reduced to rubble by Israeli bombs in 2006. Dahiyya has become a model for Israeli military planning. In 2008, IDF Northern Command Chief General Gadi Eisenkot said, quote, "What happened in the Beirut suburb of Dahiyya will happen in every village from which shots are fired in the direction of Israel. We will wield disproportionate power against every village from which shots are fired. Against every village from which shots are fired and cause immense damage and destruction. From our perspective, these are military bases. This isn't a suggestion. This is a plan that has already been authorized." Journalist Yaron London, a supporter of the Dahiyya doctrine, said, quote, "Without saying so explicitly, we reach the conclusion that nations are responsible for their leaders' acts. In practical terms, the Palestinians in Gaza are all Khalid Mashal, Hamas's leader, the Lebanese are all Nasrallah, Hezbollah's leader, and the Iranians are all Ahmadinejad," end of quote. Both men have just confessed to war crimes. Israel cannot have it both ways. It cannot put in place a strategy which is designed to inflict maximum damage upon a civilian population, a war crime, and then deny responsibility for its consequences with the excuse that its army was merely defending itself. Israel cannot associate all Gazans with Khalid Mashal and then, after killing over 1,400 people, including 1,000 civilians and hundreds of children, deny it did so with premeditation or that these actions constituted war crimes. Ariel Sharon once said, quote, "Israel may have the right to put others on trial, but certainly no one has the right to put the Jewish people and the state of Israel on trial," end of quote. Taking into account the Jewish people's long history of persecution, I understand Sharon's comment, but if anything, that history should convince Israel's leaders and supporters that no country, especially Israel, ought to be exempt from laws and conventions of behavior that attempt to maintain a degree of civility and humanity among peoples. Are Sharon and Yeshai and their ideological sympathizers models of behavior that today's Jewish people want to align themselves with? And are Richard Goldstone, the former heads of Shin Bet, and all the other prominent Israelis, Jews, and other activists from around the world who have spoken out against a brutal occupation that dehumanizes both occupier and occupied, deserving of the character assassination they have been subjected to? Or are they in reality true friends of Israel? A true friend has the courage and clear-sightedness to admonish his friend when he sees him harming others, when he sees him acting irrationally toward his neighbor. A true friend wants his friend to live in peace with his neighbor so that he can have a positive future for himself and his children. I plead with those who rationalize and support Israeli human rights abuses and daily violations of international law. If you really care about Israel and the Jewish people, do your own objective research and become a true friend instead of an enabler of dysfunctional behavior. Tshuva is one of Judaism's most fundamental concepts. It means repentance and denotes a journey through personal darkness to the light of understanding. Its actualization depends upon a personal crisis of transformation. What then is the essence of transformation if it is not about inquiring into our indoctrination and returning to our innate compassion and non-separateness? Some mystical sects of Judaism say that God accompanies each and every one of us to transform darkness and evil into light and blessing. If ever there has been a conflict that symbolizes man's fear and confusion, This protracted struggle in the Middle East is it. Our need for security can never be fulfilled as long as we see the world as a battleground between us against them, as long as we remain prisoners of our self-destructive beliefs and images, as long as we maintain the illusion of separateness. I urge everyone to find out what is real and what is false. Commit yourself to the truth to the best of your ability. That will protect you from falling into the trap of remaining unconscious of your participation in the suffering of others, of sacrificing your humanity to an unexamined belief system. This is the only path that will free you of your own suffering. The truth is that there is no real security except the commitment to truth itself. That commitment is the doorway to the end of ignorance and fear. I urge everyone to make that commitment. Thank you very much. Can I just say one more? To everybody here, my business cards are right there. If you want to friend me on Facebook, email me, go to my website. Please feel free. If you think that what I had to say has value, tell your friends all over the country. I'll go anywhere to speak and bring this message. And I'd love to get as many people as possible to read my book because it expounds on all of this. Thanks.
So now, at this point in the night, we're going to open it up to Q&A. If you could keep your comments as short as possible, that way we can just open it up to the dialogue and have Richard talk. If you want to have a prolonged comment, you can always stay after and you can talk with him after.
Roberta Roth. I've worked a lot in Palestine and Israel with the peace movement, and it's been 10 years past. So what I'm interested in knowing is what is the Israeli population's primary reaction to what's occurring? Because when I was there, Israeli citizens were criticized, if they spoke against us. A woman in black had crap thrown at them. Some of the American Jews that went over there because they were Jewish and they wanted to honor their heritage were thrown in prison if they didn't serve in the West Bank. What's going on now with the Jewish population, Israeli population?
I was there this past summer. In fact, I was there when the Mavi Marmara was attacked. It looks, from what I could see, most Israelis don't even know what's going on. I mean, most Israelis don't even pay much attention. The only people that really pay attention are the Israelis in the peace group. They told me they don't even bother with the rest of the Israeli population anymore. They're pretty disheartened. But Israel has been discussing laws about making it illegal to speak out in favor of the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement. I mean, it's getting much more polarized. Of course, Israel has the most right-wing government in its history. But still, what's happening, and I think I was telling Hilda this, is that what I see happening is because of the internet, because of cell phones, because of, we saw what happened in Egypt, how the internet and cell phones made that revolution possible. It's harder and harder for Israel to hide its war crimes. And also, so as a result, the entire world is becoming more and more aware of what is actually going on. Most people don't really read the newspapers that much from the Middle East and from Israel, but still, they see enough to know that there's something wrong. There's something putrid over there. And that is that the Palestinian people are continually being dehumanized. And so I think Israel is digging in its heels. The right-wing government really is digging in its heels, and their supporters are digging in their heels. And the reason this is accepting the fact that they've been wrong all their life, accepting the fact that their belief system has been based on myth rather than fact, is like dying, because the belief system is part of their immortal identity. It's kind of like in 2003 when just before the United States invaded Iraq, any American who spoke out against the invasion of Iraq pretty much was accused of being anti-patriotic or un-American by people who were willing to send their children over there to kill and be killed. And why were they willing to do that? It was because their images, their patriotic beliefs and images were so fused with their mortal identity that took precedence over the lives of human beings, including their very own children. So I see things getting more and more polarized. As the world becomes more and more aware and more critical of Israel, those who support Israel and have a vested interest in Israel remaining the way it is, suppressing the Palestinians, they're going to get more and more energized or angry, and it's going to get more and more polarized for a while. You know, I don't have a real good feeling about this because the United States, Congress and the administration, they're not interested in humanity, unfortunately.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for saying that. By the way, my name is Doug Ferguson, and I really appreciate you coming here and speaking to us. And I really appreciate you saying that last bit about our administration, because as a proud member of the Oregon Progressive Party, you could tell this audience, who probably half have voted for the person that AIPAC endorsed for the presidential campaign, and who stated that if there were people firing rockets at my daughters, I'd go in and do what they did, the Israelis. So I think what the Israelis are doing is completely wrong, and I'm all for Palestinian freedom and getting their land back, but until our government steps up and shows the right way to go, why would Israel listen? I mean, and you say that there's Jews in Israel who are kind of apathetic. My God, this is the biggest gathering I've seen here, and I've been to several gatherings that Mariah has put together, and it's great to see U of O students at an event like this, because I haven't seen them here before. So, and there have been other events on campus. So I don't think the education that is afforded our high school kids and middle school, and I don't know what college is like, but there is a definite, until the United States government steps up to the plate, I don't see Israel feeling the need to change.
Right, I totally agree. In fact, I was at a conference a few years ago where Ami Ayalon, who I quoted, the former Shin Bet head, and many other prominent Israelis who are much more sympathetic to the Palestinians were also speaking. And I think every one of them agreed that if there was going to be the possibility for peace, the U.S. government had to be directly involved in peace negotiations. They could not be just bilateral, and that it had to be the U.S. president who was present at these peace talks. Regarding Obama's comment when he was running for president, that if he was living in Israel, he would do anything he could to stop rocket attacks to protect his children. You know, when he said that, I thought to myself, well, would you do anything in your power if your kids were being denied medical care and were being denied food, and were having sound bombs flown over them with supersonic jets, so that they were bedwetting and having hearing problems and being traumatized? I mean, I was just, outraged by that one-dimensional statement of his.
First of all, I want to thank you for your courageous stand and just the moral courage it's taken to go down the path that you've taken. And I also want to thank the Al-Naqsa Awareness Project for bringing you and lots of other valuable speakers to town. My question is, there is a segment of progressive Jews and supporters of Israel who say they are for peace, say they are for justice, say they're opposed to the occupation, and support organizations like J Street, and are unable to support the boycott, the BDS movement. Can you address that?
Well, yeah. First of all, I support any nonviolent approach that pressures Israel to give up the occupation and make peace, because Israel's not going to do it on their own. As far as, like, J Street is the largest organization other than AIPAC, and their motto is pro-Israel, pro-peace. And what I normally say about people who insist on a two-state solution, I'm not saying that there should or should not be a one-state or two-state solution. I would not be so presumptuous as to speak for the Palestinian people. Personally, I don't see any reason why people cannot live together in peace whether they're Jewish or Palestinian. And that's my experience with the Palestinians when I was over there. I saw no hatred of Jews. And but what I normally say is, well, these Jewish people who claim that they care about the Palestinians, claim they want an end to the occupation, but want a Jewish state, basically they're still too restricted by their identity. Their identity is still coloring the way they see the world. And I said in a letter to someone one time, the J Street supporters, who is what you're mostly asking about, it's kind of like they want to have their cake and eat it too. They want to have, basically what they're doing, in my opinion, is they're paying lip service to Palestinian self-determination, but really they're blocking Palestinian self-determination because they're deluding themselves into thinking that you can have everything you want and the world will be hunky-dory. And it's not going to be that way. They have to go beyond their identity and just accept the fact that beyond identity, we're all we're all in the same boat. We're all human beings. So does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Any students have questions? Yeah.
What does your ideal Middle East look like?
My ideal Middle East? I don't know if I have an ideal Middle East, but I would say, I think all people everywhere should live in peace with each other. All people should have equal rights. I don't see any group being more privileged than another. And I will say that the United States has propped up dictatorships for a long time in order to suppress people. Here in the United States, they use the media. The media is not, you really don't read, if you just read the media in the United States, watch mainstream TV or read the New York Times or, one of the major newspapers, you're not going to get the real picture. It's really disheartening because when you don't get the real picture, you're easily influenced by the picture you get. And the picture we get here is that Arabs are terrorists, Israel's just fighting for its survival. I know the Los Angeles Times about 4 or 5 years ago did a study, and they concluded that every time an Israeli is killed by a Palestinian, that event is reported twice. But for Palestinians killed by Israelis, it takes 18 Palestinian deaths before anyone is reported once. So this is a tremendous bias in the media that is causing people to develop enemy images towards certain groups of people, in particular Arabs, and make peace impossible and increase the hatred. The hatred is immense in Israel, and it's growing. The hatred towards Palestinians, it's really growing. A lot has to do with the fact that you've got Netanyahu and Lieberman in power, and the rabbis have such huge sway over policy making and get to speak out so vocally.
I think probably most of the people here are sympathetic to your point of view.
Right.
Do you have the opportunity to talk to many groups who are not sympathetic? And what's the response that you get if you do?
I have relatives who are not sympathetic. I have an identical twin brother who lived in Israel who believes that all Arabs want to kill all Jews. And I have always been willing to speak to any group. The Jewish Federation of New Mexico, which I consider extreme right, I don't know if he's still the executive director. If he isn't, he just stopped being the executive director. I like him as a person, and I can talk to him. And I actually was in a dialogue group with him and another person from the Federation. I couldn't get through to them though, and to be honest, I haven't gotten through to anybody. No one. Basically, what I say to people is, look, all I'm asking you to do is read a book. Just read an intelligent, scholarly book by a Jewish Israeli scholar. You can check the sources. You do not have to believe a word that this person says in the book. You can put the book down anytime you want. You can read it in the comfort of your own home, and nobody has to know you're reading it. But just read a book. Because just imagine if you're supporting something that is actually not only harmful to Palestinian human beings, but is actually very harmful for Jewish and Israeli human beings. Just think what could happen if you could change your mind and another person like you could change their mind, and so on. They won't do it. And the reason they won't do it is they're terrified of confronting their identity. People are terrified of seeing the inhumanity. See, what I realized when I had my transformation is that I had been dehumanizing the Palestinians and Arabs without even knowing it. I just thought I was right. I thought the reason that I was so critical of the Palestinians and so supportive of Israel was because the Palestinians really wanted to kill the Jews. That's all. I saw it in such a stark way. When I realized just how primitive that thinking had been, I mean, like I said in the speech, it was amazing to me how relieved I was that I saw all people as human beings. I mean, I even tried to regenerate the anger and the discomfort and the disgust that I had whenever I would hear of an actual horrible terrorist event. I specifically tried to remember, didn't try to remember, but I specifically brought up the memory of that guy in the young Jewish guy in Iraq in 2003 who was beheaded by Al-Qaeda of Iraq, Berg. I don't remember his first name, but I was horrified when that happened, and I'm still horrified. But the difference is that before my transformation, my horror would have a scapegoat, meaning I would generalize my horror towards Al-Qaeda upon the Arabs. Oh, they're a bloodthirsty, pathological society. Once I had the transformation, I could not bring up that kind of generalization. What came up instead, believe it or not, was equanimity. And I realized that no matter how horrendous the behavior, and I still find the behavior just as horrendous, but I now know that even the most horrible of these extremists still have the same needs that you and I have, the right to self-determination and freedom and peace. They still really want that deep down. Their strategy of trying to find that is rather perverted, but the needs are the same underneath everything.
My name is Kamal Hassan, and I'm a Palestinian refugee born in Lebanon in direct consequence of the creation of the State of Israel. I want to thank you very much for your courage and thank everybody that is supporting the Palestinians, and especially the Al-Nakba Awareness Project that works on this subject every day. My question is this: in this horrible economic situation in the United States, and we can hardly keep our schools open, we give Israel $3.2 billion a year at least. Why is it Israel is the only country that is exempt from taking away that lots of money? In fact, they're asking for a raise.
Yeah. Well, I'm the spokesperson for the coalition to stop $30 billion to Israel, which was based on the $30 billion is the $3 billion a year, $3.2 billion a year that George W. Bush signed a memorandum about. And I think the first $3 billion began in 2008. And the stipulation is that Israel is supposed to spend 76% of the money on buying American-made arms. So in a way, it's a giveaway to the defense contractors in this country. But, the Israel lobby is just so powerful. And Congress is so ignorant. And also, of course, Congress gets their money from lobbies. That it's just amazing. But, they've got this mantra that because the Middle East is such a dangerous place, Israel is the one U.S. ally in the Middle East that we can rely on, and they know it's a lie. At least the ones who are honest with themselves, and who knows, maybe in cabinet meetings they actually acknowledge it. They know it's a lie. David Petraeus even said it, because they know that supporting Israel is what they're doing, is what the United States government is doing. I don't think there's any question about this, is they're sowing the seeds for the despair and hopelessness that leads to terrorism, and then they claim to be fighting against terrorism. It's really outrageous. But I know that I don't, like we were talking earlier, I don't think too much is going to change for quite a while. I doubt there's more than 5 Congress people, not just senators, 5 Congress people. What's that, 535 people? I doubt there's more than 5 who have ever even read a book on Israel-Palestine. I know that Joe Biden hasn't, because I always used to think he was a decent guy. I saw him on Meet the Press in the summer of 2009, and he made a few comments about Israel and Palestine, and it was obvious to me he's never read a thing. Same with Charles Schumer, the Jewish liberal Democratic senator from New York. I mean, I don't even think Hillary Clinton knows very much from what I've been hearing from her lately. So, you know, when you combine ignorance with prejudice, you're not going to get a result that's very fair.
Or do you not have a question?
The Arab Muslim world has 2.5 million square miles, right? And that's about the size of the United States. Israel has about 16,000 square miles, 1/3 of 1% of that. The Arab Muslim world has that very unearned oil wealth. The last time I checked, $50 trillion worth, if you multiply the proven reserves times the amount that they have. And they could easily set up a state, a comfortable Palestinian state out of that. Their own religion, one of the pillars of it is alms. That's 2.5% a year, whereas it's 1/3 of 1%. So why don't you just promote the Arab Muslims setting up a comfortable Palestinian state? You know, it looks like you're defending the interests of the rich man against the poor man.
That's I don't think the Palestinians are rich compared to the Israelis. No, what I'm saying is, even if you're right, even if the Arab countries do have the ability but don't have the willingness, even if they do, though, have the ability to establish a Palestinian state, why is it that the Palestinians should be kicked out of their indigenous homeland so that Jewish people don't have to live with non-Jewish people?
I have been kicked out of my homeland 5 times, you might say. I have this allergy problem, and I was forced from one place to another place. I ended up in Eugene, Oregon, which is better. I think you can make a better state than there. In the wonderful Ken Burns series on immigration, he said whole villages would move from the plains of Russia and Poland to the United States, and they would invariably take a large container, let's say a barrel, of the holy soil of Mother Russia, Mother Poland, have a central place in the life in the first generation. But that would go away after a few generations. So you can deal with those kind of problems.
Well, yeah, you can. I mean, look.
Final thing, I had a discussion, or maybe an argument with 3 Arab Muslims and about this, and they said that it wasn't the land, it was that they were tired of getting kicked around. They're kicked around by the British, the French, and the Italians, the Germans, and it's too much, no more. And so it's macho pride that you are defending.
Well, okay, but look. The fact is, it is the Palestinian land. Most of the Jews who emigrated from Eastern Europe, actually most of them didn't want to go to Palestine. Most wanted to come to the United States. The Zionist organizations, I don't know if you know this, it's in my book, the Zionist organizations blocked Franklin Roosevelt's plan to take in all of the displaced persons, all of the refugees from the, he made the plan in 44, but the plan was that after the war, the United States, England, and other Western European countries would take in the remaining Jewish survivors. But then the Zionist organizations, much to Roosevelt's surprise, went crazy. They did not want to go along with that plan because they wanted the Jews to go to Palestine because they needed a lot of Jewish people there to have the demographics necessary to have a Jewish state. What I'm saying is that, first of all, you're justifying Israel's treatment of the Palestinians. Israel is treating the Palestinians this way not because of the Palestinians. It's treating them this way because they don't want the Palestinians. Now, why? You know, from my point of view, I understand that the Jewish people needed something after the Holocaust, right? I mean, obviously, the Christian world had been persecuting them for hundreds of years, if not thousands. However, why should you make another people pay? Why should you replace one suffering group with another suffering group?
I'll talk to you after.
All right.
I was attracted to come to the talk because, like you, I'm a Jew, and like you, I have my sister and her family is ultra-Orthodox, living in Jerusalem. And not only that, but my brother-in-law makes his living traveling the world and talking about pro-Israel concepts. So he was actually scheduled to come here to Eugene, and I sent him an email kind of joking that, you should be careful if you come to Eugene because you'll get a lot of hecklers in the audience. I haven't heard from him since. My mom's going into a nursing home, and I keep writing them saying, we need to discuss this as a family. I haven't heard back. So I didn't know. I mean, it's interesting because we can have all sorts of discussions on religion, and it's fine. But I made this one comment to them about politics I haven't heard. But my question, and I'm one of those people that was raised Reform, and from day one, it was all about return, what is that, next year in Jerusalem. I mean, every Jew hears that every year, next year in Jerusalem. So it is an indoctrination. It starts really early. And my question kind of is that you made a point about Zionism as racism, and I don't really understand what you were trying to say.
What I was saying was that for most Jews, actually I agree that Zionism is racism. However, what I was trying to say that for most Jewish people that I knew growing up did not realize that there was a Zionist, that part of the ideology of Zionism was that we should kick these people out, these other people out. Most Jews, now remember, I was born in 1948, 3 years after the Holocaust. My mother had 17 relatives die in the Holocaust. My grandparents came over from Russia and Poland, and so they were familiar with the pogroms. And they got over to the United States before the Holocaust happened, but they had relatives die, incinerated. But my point was that for most Jewish people who did not study the history, most of us thought, well, Zionism is necessary because the world wants to kill us. So if the world wants to kill us, God, we at least have this one small place the size of New Jersey where we can go, where no one's going to discriminate against us and throw us into concentration camps. That was the thinking. Okay, so most of these people had no idea the implications of their thinking. They had no idea that most European Jews, even the ones in the United States, had no idea that most European Jews did not want to go to Israel. And by the way, and I didn't find this out until I started doing my research, none of the religious Jews, including Reform Jews originally, supported Zionism. They felt Zionism was heresy, because Zionism is nationalism. It's the establishment of a Jewish state by human beings, by people, rather than by God. Okay? So the religious Jews, including the Reform movement originally, believed that it would be heretical to support Zionism because only the Moshiach, the Jewish Messiah, can establish a state of Israel. But then, of course...
But if you look at at Herzl, and what he was trying to do with Zionism, he was going to establish it in Uganda.
That's because he was secular, but the Zionist organizations wouldn't take him seriously. However, Herzl did say we should get rid of that they should get rid of the Palestinians, and he was willing to pay them compensation, but he wanted to get rid of them. There's a lot. You got to read. There's just so much. The more you read, the more you open your eyes, and the more astounded you are. It's really amazing.
So your thesis basically about Zionism is that it was a minority of Jewish nationalists that had an agenda and that manipulated everybody.
Well, with the help. I gave my thesis, but with the help of you just want me to expound on it. The European countries did not want to take responsibility for the Jewish problem. So what they did was they foisted it on to the Palestinian people who are not white and live in a part of the world that is foreign. Okay, they could have taken responsibility. England, France, all these countries, the United States, they could have taken responsibility. But instead, they said, well, let's just let them go over to this other country in the Middle East, and we won't have to worry about it. Really, that's an oversimplification, but that's kind of the idea.
There was a question over here for a while.
Well, I just want to follow up. I think there was also an international political benefit to the powers of Britain and the United States to have a European type state in the middle of the Middle East.
That was one of the arguments that the Zionists made, yes.
But my question is just a personal one in your story. What was it that kind of shifted you? That was a fairly recent shift you're talking about.
In the summer of 2006.
A series of drops that suddenly kind of...
No, it happened quicker than that. In a sense, what happened was I was very upset when the Second Lebanon War started on July 12th, 2006. What I saw was, well, of course, I read the reports. Israel was retaliating because the day before Hezbollah had abducted 2 Israeli soldiers and killed 2 or 3 in northern Israel. Okay, so they'd gone across the border from southern Lebanon. And that happened just 3 weeks after Gilad Shalit had been captured by Hamas on the Gaza-Israel border. So I was outraged. I saw this as probably an orchestrated kidnapping by people who they're just never going to give up their hatred of Israel. To me, it was the final straw. God, after all this, as powerful as Israel is, these people just hate Jews. They're never going to be happy until the Jews are gone. So that's all I could talk about. So I talked about that with these friends of mine, these 2 very close friends of mine who were very critical of, maybe not, yeah, they're very critical of Israel, but in a mild way. They both happen to be very compassionate people, but they were rather mild, but yet still forceful in a way. And I started complaining to them. And this time I thought, well, now they're going to agree with me, especially, first Hamas, then Hezbollah, and they didn't. And it just reinforced my anger. It just made me even more entrenched in my opinion. And then just by serendipity, I guess you could call it, a friend of mine who I spoke to maybe once every year, and who I'd known all my life, he's a friend of mine in Andes, happened to call me up because he was going to be coming. What's that? He was going to be going to a bar mitzvah in Colorado, and he was going, which Andy went to, and he was going to drive down and see me. Now I knew that Sammy had been studying this issue for many years. Whenever he said something I didn't like, I just ignored it though. But he was very mild about it. He was not forceful at all. He was much less forceful than my other friends. He was very laid back. So while we were talking on the phone about him coming to visit me after the bar mitzvah, I started complaining about Hezbollah and Hamas. And I went on for like 2 hours. And he just let me talk. And every once in a while he'd interject and say, no, Richie, you're wrong. That's not right. But he never resisted my point of view. He never judged me in any way. It was like he had given me the space to maybe challenge or look into my own views. And at the end of the conversation, he said, hey, why don't you read some books by Baruch Kimberling or Tanya Reinhardt, 2 Jewish Israeli professors who have since died. And he says, and there's a website you can go to called commondreams.org, and there's some good writers on that. And I said, yeah, maybe I'll do that. Because the only book I had read, which reinforced my beliefs, was the universally, and I didn't know it at the time, was the universally debunked from time immemorial by Joan Peters, one of Alan Dershowitz's main sources, which has been completely debunked. So what happened was I took Sammy's advice and I went to the library and I got out some books and I started reading. And what I was reading in my home, I couldn't believe what I was reading at first. I was shocked. And I went through a complete series of emotions. And then I put the book down to take a breather from this onslaught of unbelievable information about collective punishment, the use of lethal force in situations where none was warranted, the demolition of homes, all kinds of stuff, political liquidations, assassinations. I put the book down and just closed my eyes. And then I don't know how much time passed, but I opened my eyes and I had no negative emotions whatsoever. It was like I was completely cleansed. And then I noticed I could not find an exclusive identity. I could not find a separate identity. I tried to reanimate this Jewish identity. I could find none. And then what happened is I realized that I was as much Palestinian as Israeli and as much Muslim or Christian as Jew, that I was not separate from anybody. And then all these insights arose about compassion and clarity and how fear was the lens through which I'd been looking at the world. And when you look through the world with the lens of fear, like I said in the speech, anyone who does not meet your definition, that fits within your definition of your identity, is seen as a threat. And so I was superimposing, this is what we all do, I was superimposing these negative images that were developed through the stories I heard about Al-Qaeda and just hatred of Jews, Nazis. I was superimposing those images onto all Arab people rather than just the ones who were doing the violent acts. And so I was not able to see the world clearly. When that was relinquished, I regained my humanity, you could say. Okay, but what's happening is this is a universal problem, and in the case of Judaism, the fear of another Holocaust has become so ingrained in people, even though it's not even conscious, that people are incapable of acknowledging that there could be any truth that Jewish people could do the same things that Nazis or other people do or have done. So it's almost impossible because it's an identity problem. That's why you can't get through to people, or very few people. Does that answer your question? Okay.
Quick comment?
Yes, this is a filmed presentation, and so I need to clarify something for the audience and people who will be viewing this later on television. Actually, there was great empathy and sympathy for the Jewish refugees in Europe. And our country wanted to do something about that. And so it was called the Stratton Bill of 1947. That would have increased the quotas allowed for immigration from Europe. So these Jewish refugees would come into Europe. It would have totally taken care of the refugee problem. However, that bill never passed, and the reason why it didn't pass is because Zionist Jews in this country did not want it to pass, because if the refugee problem, the European Jewish refugee problem, was taken care of, there would be no political momentum for this new state of Israel. So that means you can look that up. The Stratton Bill of 1947, and a good book that goes into this into detail is Alan Hart's book, Zionism, the Real Enemy of the Jews, Volume 1. And his books talk about the political history of the U.S. regarding the state of Israel. I have to leave at this moment in time, but I really want to thank you.
You're welcome.
And I want to thank you, Bashar, and everyone. Thank you very much.
Let me amplify just slightly. That was brought about by the Zionist Organization of America, which was a predecessor to AIPAC. And this is how powerful this organization was even back then. And even back during the First World War, it was this organization, the World Zionist Congress, that actually got America involved in the First World War.
Right. You're not leaving, are you?
I just got something on my car, so they can...
I'm staying with you, aren't I? Are there any other questions?
I just want to make a brief comment about what we can do to support Palestine liberation here in this country, and that is A, educate ourselves, and B, support Palestinian civil society for boycott, divest, and sanction Israel. And there's a great packet, a very comprehensive packet of what BDS is, and it's on that table back there. So please pick it up and figure out how you can get involved.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you for speaking, but one of the reasons I came here was because I don't know very much about this issue, and I was wondering what realistic and specific things you think that the Israeli government and the Palestinian government could do to work towards peace.
Well, the Israeli government is always trying to avoid peace, honestly. It's a smokescreen so that they can keep gobbling up more territory. The Palestinian government, I would like to see Fatah and Hamas unite and become one. I mean, I'm not crazy about Hamas, but you know, Israel established Hamas in collaboration with the Muslim Brotherhood of Egypt in 1987 as an alternative to Fatah, and they even armed Hamas. They thought a religious alternative would weaken Fatah. But you know, when you take away hope from people, when you force them to live in horrible conditions, when you take away when you try to take away their self-respect and you humiliate them, what do you expect is going to happen? Hamas arose because they're unwilling to to collaborate with Israel, and they're unwilling to just give up their homeland. So what really has to happen, in my opinion, is the United States, the people of the United States, and all over the world, but the United States is critical, have to really lobby their congressmen and demand that the United States, instead of looking out for the apparent interest of a small number of Israelis, the ones who do not believe in living with anyone other than Jews, instead of looking out for the small interest of maybe 100,000 Israelis, they have to look out for the interest of their own citizens. And then the discourse can start to change. But in the meantime, like, say your Hosina? Hosina. As Hosina said, I support the BDS movement, the Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions movement. And, she can probably give you more information. But, send your Congress people every month or maybe 5 times a year, send them a postcard saying, hey, I'd like you to consider this. We just have to change the consciousness. That's what really has to change. People have to become more aware of what's going on and less apathetic. And then things may be able to change.
So on the American side, do you think one of the main things Americans could do is to lessen their support for the Israeli government? But what do you think the Israeli government, not necessarily the American side, but the Israeli government could do to work?
Well, of course, the Israeli government is dependent on who gets voted in. Rabin had somewhat of a change of heart, although what he was going to offer the Palestinians was less than what Barak offered in 2000. But the Israeli government today, they're, in my opinion, incorrigible. They're not going to do anything. Netanyahu's going to make a provisional peace plan that's just buying him time. It's going to be something that will be unacceptable. The United States has to pressure Israel. The United States has to demand that Israel give up the occupation, really, and use the Saudi Arabian plan of 2002 that would give Israel complete diplomatic relations with every Arab country in return to the 1967 borders. They at least have to start with that.
So without that push, Israel...
Right, without that push, Israel's not going to do it, because the Zionist ideology is really a greater Israel. David Ben-Gurion, even though later in his life he said he wanted a smaller Israel, what he wanted during his career was that Israel split Jordan with Iraq, that Israel take the southern half of Lebanon for itself, and the northern half be a Christian Maronite country. That's what he wanted. And the United Nations, Russia and the United States almost tried to kick Israel out of the UN for that. So the Zionist ideology is we want more, more, more.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment, and I've talked with Rich about this many times, about that little 4-letter word, fear. And it can be a great acronym. False events appearing real. So it's just something we could think about.
And tell everybody what risk is, the acronym about risk.
Risk, really interested in seeking knowledge.
Thank you.
It seems to me that the United States government isn't supporting Israel because we love Israel. I think we support Israel because our legislators and presidents are buried in money from AIPAC and they live in fear of the Zionist-dominated media.
Right.
So it seems to me there's no one that I can write a letter to tomorrow that's going to make any difference. The issue is this fear that is Zionism that's going to either have to dissipate or soften with the passage of generations or whatever. I mean, it seems that the core of the problem is within the Jewish community.
I agree with you. When I say, I also agree with what I think is the implication of what you're saying, that it has to start from the ground up. But I figure every little bit helps. If you send a letter to a congressman, they do look at this stuff. And at least it gets them thinking a little bit. Like in New Mexico, well, Jeff Bingaman is retiring. He's a senator. He did stand up on the Senate floor and speak out against the resolution. I can't remember which. It was either the resolution condemning the world or something for criticizing Israel about Operation Cast Lead in Gaza. It was one of these ridiculous resolutions that the Senate was going to vote on that basically gave Israel a free pass on killing people. And Bingaman stood up and spoke before the Senate against it, which was a fairly courageous act, although he probably knew he was retiring at the time. But still, we had been sending him letters on a fairly regular basis. I had been to his office a couple times with people, and although we didn't meet with him himself, we met with his chief aide. So you never know. I mean, this stuff, a little bit at a time. It only takes one senator who's really going to stand up and really speak out, more than what Bingaman did. But just imagine if, not that John McCain would ever do it, but just imagine that someone like John McCain or his Democratic equivalent got up and really spoke about the horrors of the Israeli occupation. Just imagine what kind of debate that would and dialogue that would create in the United States. it would start creating a change of consciousness. People would come out of the woodwork and start saying, yeah, you know, something's always smelled wrong to me for quite a while. Let's stop giving all that money to Israel so they can kill Palestinians, and let's use it over here. Or give it to the Palestinians so they can have their own state. Something like that.
Well, just imagine the American public really knowing what's going on.
That would be
I mean, you know.
the Israeli public knowing what's going on.
Yeah, you know, yeah, that's true too. But at least in the Israeli, well, not the Israeli government, but in some of the Israeli people do know what's going on. Most of the Israeli people, in my experience, and I spent a lot of time there, were afraid to go in the territory. I mean, I'd say, come with me to see what the soldiers are doing. And they'd say, no, they'll kill me, I'm Jewish. And I said, well, I look as Jewish as you, so come with me and I'll show you what the soldiers are doing. They wouldn't come, but they were standing up for peace. But I think our American people, now I don't know if the students here can help me out, but our American people have no concept of the Arab world, concept of the Arab world. And this comment about putting all, you know, there's plenty of Arab land, well, that's like saying all Europeans should go to Sweden, for God's sakes. I mean, you know, Arab people in Iraq have much different culture than the Arab people in Jordan, even though they're neighbors. And it's naive to believe differently. I want to say a couple things, though, that I think are important for us to really honor.
Please make them quick.
Okay. Well, one, an elderly Palestinian man in 1989, when I was over there, said, we elders are trying to stick around because our children have never known peace. We're hoping to stick around for them to know peace so that they can learn to live with peace. And I thought that was a beautiful statement. Another one was a little boy that was 15 and was thrown in jail for resistance. And his brother was thrown in jail 2 weeks later because he was a brother. And he said, we in prison, don't you think we love peace even more because we're incarcerated?
Yeah.
And
most have been incarcerated, most males.
And most males, instead of a bar mitzvah, instead of a confirmation, their rite of passage is 5 years in jail.
Yeah. Thank you.
I don't want to sound cynical, but I think it's not going to stop because they're all making too much money. But I haven't worked out a language to even talk about it. It's so overwhelming. The intertwined nature of the fear, the politics with the business as usual of exploiting every last resource on the earth.
But Joanne.
So, and I'm really not cynical. I decided not to ever be cynical. But I'm getting so frustrated lately with trying to figure out where to start, because I've been hearing the same thing. Well, we've all been hearing the same thing for so long. And so I hope that there's somebody up there somewhere who's putting together some serious sustainable business practice ethics that can start addressing the ecology of the earth and of society, and understand how we can't institutionalize predation so thoroughly.
I'm curious think tanks, whether or not they have much influence.
Disaster.
Right.
Everywhere.
Right. Yeah, that's what's happening. The world is going crazy. A friend of mine once said to me, the world is getting crazier by the minute. And that was 6 years ago, and it's a lot crazy. And he was right, I think, because it's a lot crazier today than it was 6 years ago.
I just have a real quick question. Do you give many talks?
I've given a few, not as many as I would like. I've really only given a few. I would like to.
I mean, it's brilliant and timely and very
Thank you.
refreshing in many ways.
I need to get invited places.
Okay.
You know, I have to tell you, a lot of people. Thank you. I mean, a lot of people, even in the who I support, a lot of people who are in the Palestinian rights movement, non-Palestinian people, they won't give me the time of day. They don't want to hear about identity and all that. They just want to, they also have an us against them mentality.
When did your book publish?
My book was published in November by me.
So it has all the arguments that you make?
Yeah, oh, it goes in depth into all of this stuff, yeah.
Because
I did read that our 2 senators receive a lot of money.
For getting reelected.
Yeah.
You know?
So that's the crux of the whole.
That has a lot to do with it.
We can all, the whole community can see that, can see the injustices that are happening. And if the veto cannot happen, which we discussed a little earlier, and if it doesn't come from Congress, it's not going to help. I don't know, I'm very...
As long as the first thing is, before it's ever going to come from Congress, is the people have to start discussing it more, and it has to become part of the public consciousness. Telling our friends about it, telling our neighbors, and reading books like mine. I mean, I think my book has a certain unique message that is not in other books, and you know, stuff like that. Reading books by Ilan Pappé, by Anna Bolzer, by Norman Finkelstein. I mean, we have to do all of that.
That book that you mentioned by Tanya Reinhardt,
right.
I gave it to Kucinich personally.
Oh, really? Yeah. Well, Kucinich is one of those 5 Congress people. But even he voted for one of those horrible resolutions. Even he did. Usually he's pretty decent. Yeah. Right.
Reasonable.
Yeah, I agree.
But I gave it to him personally.
Very good.
Yeah. He wanted my telephone number to get back to me. I never heard.
He's married. Oh, okay. I'm kidding. I know, I was teasing you.
I just wanted to tell you that Mariah and I attended a town hall meeting of Ron Wyden, who's one of the worst Zionists in Congress, in the Senate. She hand-delivered to him a copy of Ilan Pappé's Landing in Palestine. Said, "Senator, read this on the plane back to Washington." I bet he hasn't...
No, probably not. Ilan Pappé endorsed my book, by the way. Yeah. That was a nice coup. Yeah, it was very nice of him. Yeah, he's a very nice man. Thank you.
Everyone give Rich another round.
Thank you.
Are you selling the book here?
Oh, yeah.
How much is it?
$20.
$20. Tell me.
Thank you.